Hello and welcome back to the Royal Insider Central video. I hope you are doing great today. I have got another exciting video for you, so make sure you watch until the end. If you're new here, do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now, let's get straight into today's video. Okay, let's go.
I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
There are moments in the history of a monarchy when silence becomes louder than any official statement. This may be one of them. Behind the gates of royal residences, where tradition, inheritance, and family loyalty have shaped generations, a startling claim has emerged, one involving alleged estate transfer records, questions surrounding their authenticity, and the name of Queen Camilla. According to the premise now circulating, documents connected to a hidden estate transfer have allegedly raised serious questions, with claims that parliamentary scrutiny uncovered possible forgery records. But as the story unfolds, one question hangs over everything. What is actually verified, and what remains an allegation? I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. King Charles had survived family rebellion, public humiliation, and years of private tension, but nothing prepared him for the file placed before Parliament that morning. Music. The documents did not merely question Queen Camilla's judgment. They appeared to show forged estate transfer records, music, carrying royal authorization that Charles insisted he had never approved. When the king finally saw the disputed signature, music, witnesses expected anger. Instead, he went completely silent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stared at the same signature 3 times before lowering the pages onto the table. Music. Parliament had exposed hidden estate transfer records linked to Camilla's household, and the accusation was devastating. Music. Valuable royal-linked property interests had been reassigned through paperwork carrying the monarch's supposed approval. An estate transfer instrument is a legal document used to move ownership or control of property from one party to another, but here the meaning was explosive because the king insisted he had never signed it. Music. The records suggested authority had been copied and used. Camilla learned that her office had been named in the parliamentary file. She did not ask what newspapers would say. She asked whether Charles had seen the documents. That revealed where the fear lived. The queen consort understood that public criticism could be managed, but a forged signature threatened trust inside the marriage and control inside the crown. Charles kept reading. The longer he studied the approval notation, the more the room seemed to tighten. The first fracture appeared in the date. A parliamentary clerk flagged one approval entry attached to an estate holding that under its trust arrangement was never supposed to move without direct royal authorization. A trust arrangement is a legal structure controlling how property is held and managed for specific beneficiaries or purposes. Music. The notation claimed Charles approved the transfer on a day when his documented schedule placed him elsewhere. That was not a clerical mismatch. It was the first clean break between the official record and the king's own movements. Music. William was then told something even more unsettling. His name appeared in an internal objection attached to the original transfer file, but that objection had vanished before the final papers were processed. The prince had not merely been completely left out. His resistance may have been deliberately erased. Charles closed the folder, removed his glasses, and finally asked the question. No one in the room wanted to answer. Who signed this in my name? But before the palace could discover who had copied the king's authority, one question became impossible to avoid. How much had Camilla known before Parliament opened the file? The scandal was dangerous because it involved property, signatures, music, and parliamentary scrutiny. But for Charles, those details were almost secondary. At the center of the crisis stood the woman beside him, and a question no monarch wants to ask inside his own marriage. Had his trust been used as protection for something he would never have approved? As Camilla waited for him to speak, silence became more frightening than accusation. Charles refused to see her immediately. That decision cut deeper than any public statement could have done. The king depended on loyalty inside a monarchy where private relationships and constitutional duty could never be separated for long. Constitutional responsibility simply means the monarch must protect the integrity of the crown even when family loyalties make that painful. Camilla understood that reality because the disputed estate papers had moved through administrative channels connected to her household. Her name was now tied not only to a controversial transfer, but to the possibility that his authority had been misused. Camilla listened as an aide quietly told her that Charles needed time. She dismissed everyone from the room, reached toward the telephone, then stopped before touching it. The queen consort wanted to call him, but she knew that forcing a conversation could make the damage worse. She sat alone instead, realizing that the man who had defended her through years of criticism was now wondering whether she had concealed something from him. William faced a different kind of conflict. Music. He wanted to protect his father from another personal wound. Yet the prince also understood that protecting Charles from the evidence would only weaken him. He demanded that every record be examined, including an internal memorandum carrying his own earlier objection to changes in estate control. A memorandum is simply a formal written note used to record advice, objections, or decisions. When investigators compared the files, they discovered that his objection had been removed before the final approval packet reached the palace. Camilla finally gave her own account in a documented private statement to the internal review. She admitted that she had authorized discussions about restructuring the estate arrangement, but she insisted she had never instructed anyone to reproduce Charles's signature or fabricate his approval. Music. That distinction mattered. It separated knowledge of the transfer proposal from knowledge of the apparent forgery, but it did not explain why the process continued after the king had resisted it. Charles absorbed that statement without offering reassurance. Then investigators found something neither of them could ignore. An old meeting entry from months earlier, marking the exact evening when William challenged the transfer. Camilla pushed back and the monarch ordered that nothing proceed without his written consent. To understand why that forgotten meeting now terrified everyone involved, the story had to return to the night when a difficult estate dispute crossed the line into something far more dangerous. Months before Parliament saw a single suspicious signature, the warning had already been given. It came during a private estate meeting that almost everyone later wished had never taken place. What began as an argument over management rights ended with William refusing to approve a proposed transfer, Camilla pushing for reconsideration, and Charles believing the matter had been postponed. Yet, somebody left that room determined to make the transfer happen anyway. William had challenged the proposal because the property was not an ordinary private holding. It sat inside a royal-linked estate arrangement with rules restricting how control could be reassigned without formal approval. In simple terms, the ownership structure meant no one could quietly move key interests without leaving a clear legal trail. Camilla believed those restrictions had become outdated. She argued that restructuring would make management faster and more practical. Music, but the prince saw something more dangerous, a change that could later look like private influence, reshaping royal assets. Camilla took his resistance as a direct accusation. She told William that constant suspicion made normal estate decisions almost impossible, and he answered that royal stewardship demanded more caution, not less. Charles watched the exchange harden. The king knew the argument was no longer about paperwork. Music. It had become a test of trust between his wife and his son. With both convinced they were protecting something important, Charles ended the meeting before the tension could become openly hostile. He pushed the unsigned transfer sheet back across the table and made his instruction unmistakable. Nothing was to proceed without his written approval. That Windsor meeting held 3 months before Parliament opened the records became the decisive trigger. His order should have stopped everything. William understood it as a rejection. Camilla gathered her papers slowly, said nothing, and left with the matter apparently closed. Days later, the impossible happened. Music. A revised transfer packet reappeared inside the administrative chain, carrying what looked like the very authorization Charles had refused to give. Music. The change was not minor. The rejected draft had been replaced. Music. And William's formal objection had vanished from the file. A documented internal record later showed that someone had removed his memorandum before the new packet moved forward. William would eventually realize that his warning had not been ignored by accident. Someone had deliberately cleared the obstacle he represented. Camilla would later insist through her private documented account that she never ordered the alteration, while Charles would be left confronting a far darker possibility. Someone inside the system had decided his refusal was merely a problem to be solved. Months later, when that rejected document returned with the king's signature attached, Charles no longer needed another briefing. Music. He needed Camilla in the room with him. Charles did not summon advisors, lawyers, or senior quarters. He asked for Camilla alone. Between them sat the parliamentary file, open to the signature neither of them could ignore. For several seconds, the king said nothing. Then he pushed the forged authorization across the table and asked the question that had been consuming him since morning. Not who created it, not who filed it, but whether his wife had known. Camilla understood immediately why the question hurt more than the document itself. Parliamentary investigators had already established that the transfer packet moved through administrative channels connected to her household. Those channels were simply the chain of staff, approvals, and internal offices through which estate paperwork passed before reaching final authorization. Charles knew that knowing about a transfer was not the same as ordering a forgery, but emotionally that distinction gave him little comfort. Music. He needed to know whether she had watched the process continue after his refusal and chosen not to tell him. Charles asked her directly whether she knew his approval had been manufactured. Camilla denied it. She insisted she had never seen a false signature created, never instructed anyone to copy his name, and never been told that the authorization was fabricated. Then came the admission that changed the tone of the room. The Queen Consort acknowledged that she had expected the transfer to move forward after the Windsor disagreement because she believed officials were still working through the objections. Camilla faltered when he asked why she had not mentioned that expectation to him. She said she believed the matter was being resolved properly and that the concerns raised by William were being handled through normal internal review. Charles did not answer immediately. Instead, the king reached for another page and slid it toward her. It was the prince's missing memorandum, the objection that should have remained inside the approval file. Music. Camilla read the first paragraph and stopped. She placed both hands on the table and said quietly that she had never seen it before. That single sentence shifted the crisis. William's objection had not faded away through routine administration. Someone had deliberately removed it. Then she noticed a routing notation carrying the initials of a senior household official she knew well. Her defense stopped mid-sentence. Charles saw the change in her immediately. Camilla now understood that someone close to her may have manipulated the process, misled her, and used the king's authority as cover. He ordered the official removed from estate responsibilities at once. But William, after reviewing the documented chain, warned his father that one person could not have altered every stage alone. Camilla's denial changed the direction of the crisis. But it did not make it smaller, because the next question was no longer whether a record had been forged, but who possessed enough authority to make the forgery function. A forged signature is only ink until someone accepts it. That realization transformed the palace scandal overnight. The deeper investigators looked, the less the case resembled the work of one reckless official. Files had been redirected. Objections had vanished. Internal checks had been bypassed. Music. And somewhere between Camilla's household, the estate administration, and the final approval process, somebody had understood exactly which doors needed to open and which people needed to remain silent. William sat with Charles and chose every word carefully. The prince knew his father was already carrying the weight of a damaged marriage, a public scandal, and the knowledge that his authority had been used without consent. But he also knew that hesitation could make the crisis worse. The crown's estate system required several layers of documented approval, meaning a successful forgery needed more than a false signature. It needed access, timing, and people willing to let the paperwork move. Charles admitted the truth quietly. Investigating Camilla's household felt like investigating part of his own home. The king understood that any scrutiny could expose private conversations, trusted staff, and decisions never meant to leave palace walls. Yet, shielding those people would risk something even more serious. The belief that royal status could protect wrongdoing. William placed the investigative authorization beside him. His father stared at the signature line, signed it, and returned the pen without speaking. Investigators moved quickly once that authority was granted. A documented review of the administrative route showed that the forged approval had been paired with a backdated routing note. A routing note is simply an internal record showing where a document moved, who handled it, and when. By changing that date, someone had made the transfer appear as though every required step had happened in the correct order. The next discovery made the stakes even higher. A second estate record showed that long-term control of the property would eventually have shifted into a structure benefiting individuals selected through Camilla's administrative circle. The queen consort had not yet been proven to have ordered anything illegal, but the appearance was devastating. Her office was now connected to both the pathway and the potential beneficiaries. Then the paper trail turned back toward her directly. Music. An internal log showed that Camilla herself had requested an update on the transfer after Charles had already ordered that nothing proceed without his written approval. William read the entry twice. The king did the same. Music. That signature gave investigators permission to go everywhere. But the first discovery they brought back threatened to destroy Camilla's defense completely. By the next morning, Camilla was no longer facing a single suspicious document. She was facing a timeline. Her calls, administrative requests, meeting notes, and estate updates were being placed beside the forged transfer records one by one. The picture was painful, music, and increasingly difficult to explain. She still denied ordering any false signature, but one newly recovered message proved she had continued asking about the transfer after Charles believed the matter was dead. Camilla received the suspension order privately and understood immediately who had approved it. Music. Charles had authorized the disputed estate transfer to be frozen. Music. And had stripped her estate-related staff of independent control while investigators separated legitimate decisions from manipulated records. Music. A suspension order is a formal instruction that temporarily stops an action or authority while a matter is reviewed. She read his authorization slowly, folded the paper once, then asked everyone in the room to leave. Music. Charles faced pressure to defend her publicly, but the king refused. He told advisors that protecting the crown no longer meant protecting people from painful facts. It meant allowing the record to speak before loyalty shaped the outcome. That choice hurt him because Camilla was not simply another figure under investigation. She was his wife. Yet he also knew that one premature defense could make every later finding look compromised. Camilla's position weakened when investigators recovered her own request for an update on the transfer after the Windsor meeting. The queen consort had said she believed the proposal was being resolved through normal channels. But this message appeared to show that she was still actively following its progress. She reread the date and felt the significance immediately. If she knew the transfer was still alive, then Charles would inevitably ask why she had never told him. Then the next message changed everything again. A documented reply to Camilla's request. Music. Stated that royal authorization has been secured. She stopped when she reached those words. The message had been sent after Charles had ordered that nothing move forward without his written approval. Someone had explicitly told her that the king had changed his mind. Camilla pressed her fingers against her forehead. As the chronology finally aligned, her request no longer automatically proved that she had ignored Charles. It opened a different possibility. She may have continued because someone inside the administrative chain had falsely assured her that his approval existed. Music. The same person who manipulated the paperwork may also have manipulated her understanding of what the monarch had decided. Charles read the recovered exchange and said nothing for several moments. For the first time, the evidence did not only accuse Camilla. It also supported part of her defense. For the first time, the evidence could support Camilla's claim, but only one conversation could determine whether Charles was willing to believe her again. There were no secretaries outside the table, no parliamentary papers being passed between officials, and no lawyers translating every sentence. Music. Charles and Camilla finally faced each other without the institution between them. The king had spent days asking whether his authority had been stolen. Camilla had spent those same days wondering whether her husband believed she had stolen it. What followed did not erase the scandal, but it changed where the blame would ultimately fall. Camilla spoke first because the recovered correspondence had already changed the shape of the case. It showed that she had been told Charles reversed his refusal and formally approved the estate transfer. Investigators had traced that message to a senior official with access to both her estate correspondence and the approval routing process. That process simply means the internal chain used to move documents from one decision point to the next. The same person had been close enough to influence what she saw and what the king was told. Camilla did not hide behind procedure. She admitted privately that she should have questioned the sudden reversal instead of accepting it because it gave her the result she wanted. "I should have asked you," she said. Charles looked at her for a long moment before answering. Yes, you should have. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anger. The king believed she had not ordered the false signature, yet her failure to speak to him directly had damaged something far harder to repair. Camilla then produced a saved personal note she had written when she first learned that Charles had supposedly changed his mind. The documented note recorded her surprise at the reversal and her relief that the transfer could move forward. It supported her claim that she believed the authorization was genuine. The queen consort had made a serious mistake, but the evidence was beginning to separate that mistake from the act of forgery itself. Charles received the final confirmation soon after. Access records placed the senior official at the center of all three critical points: the forged authorization, William's suppressed memorandum, and the misleading message sent to Camilla. The pattern was no longer accidental. Someone had engineered the process from inside. Charles made his decision with no celebration. Camilla would be cleared of personally forging his approval, but she would permanently lose control over the estate management channel that allowed the deception to survive. She accepted the consequence because both understood the same painful truth. Innocence of forgery did not erase failure of judgment. Music. Their marriage had survived the private reckoning, but the monarchy still had to survive the public one, and by morning, Britain had already chosen the image that would define the scandal. The scandal escaped palace walls before breakfast. Across Britain, the argument was no longer confined to estate law or internal royal procedure. It became a story about trust, whose signature could be believed, whether private influence had crossed a constitutional line, and whether Charles could punish failures inside his own household. Then one newspaper front page reduced Music Days of Evidence to a single brutal image. The king's disputed signature enlarged across the entire page. Charles watched the coverage beside William and said almost nothing. Parliament had released a summarized chronology confirming that his authorization had been falsified and that the estate transfer had been frozen before final implementation. A summarized chronology is simply an official timeline showing what happened, in what order, and who handled each stage. That mattered because the public could now see the deception as a sequence, music, rather than a rumor. The palace also announced a restructuring of estate approvals, making clear that the old system had failed badly enough to require immediate change. William listened as broadcasters described the scandal as a betrayal originating inside the royal household. The prince could see the words landing on his father one after another. Charles had already accepted that his authority had been copied. Hearing the country describe that act as betrayal made the wound personal all over again. Music. When one presenter asked whether the king had been protected by his own staff or manipulated by them, William reached for the remote and turned the television off. His father did not ask him to turn it back on. Camilla faced a different humiliation. Music. She had avoided the gravest accusation because the evidence supported her claim that she had not ordered the forged signature. But the queen consort knew that public trust in her judgment had still been damaged. She had accepted an approval she wanted without confirming it directly with Charles. That failure now sat beside every headline, even if it was not the same as forgery. Then one image captured the entire scandal. The Daily Chronicle published an enlarged reproduction of the disputed signature beneath the headline. Signed by who? Television broadcasters repeatedly placed it beside an authenticated signature from Charles, turning a complicated estate inquiry into something millions could understand instantly. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace as broadcasters announced that the senior estate official responsible for routing the falsified records, Music, had been dismissed and referred for further investigation. The mood was no longer curiosity. It was judgment. By evening, Charles understood what remained. He could return to the old palace instinct of quiet containment, or he could make every consequence public. Music. By evening, the evidence had exposed the deception. The public had delivered its judgment, and only the king's final verdict remained. Charles could not undo the forged signature. He could not erase the moment he looked across a table and wondered whether his own wife had helped misuse his authority. And he could not restore the trust that disappeared the instant Parliament opened those records. But he could decide what happened next. In the end, the king's response became larger than the transfer itself because Charles chose accountability even when accountability reached directly into his marriage. Charles received the final investigative conclusion without celebration. Music. The review established that he had never approved the estate transfer and that his authorization had been deliberately falsified by a senior official who manipulated the internal approval chain. That chain is simply the sequence of people and checks required before a major estate decision becomes valid. The finding mattered because it cleared the monarch of involvement while proving that someone close to the royal system had used his authority as a weapon. Camilla received a different judgment. She was cleared of personally creating or ordering the forged signature, but she was formally removed from independent involvement in the affected estate management structure because she had failed to verify the supposed reversal of Charles's decision. The Queen Consort accepted the consequence without protest privately. He told her that he believed she had not forged his name. But the king also made clear that trust could not return simply because the worst accusation had fallen away. William watched his father make the final decision and understood the cost immediately. The prince had seen Charles defend family members through painful moments before. But this time, the monarch chose institutional credibility over private protection. The suppressed objection carrying William's warning was restored to the official record, and the manipulated transfer was permanently voided. New procedures were ordered requiring direct authentication for future high-level estate transfers, meaning no major approval could move forward without confirmation from the person whose authority was being used. Charles then signed the final cancellation order and placed the pen down. He told William that no royal household could demand trust while refusing accountability. The senior official at the center of the false approval chain was permanently removed from royal estate duties, closing the route through which the deception had survived. Camilla remained beside Charles, but something had changed between them. She kept her place, yet her authority was reduced, and their trust carried a permanent scar. William left with renewed confidence that the monarchy could correct itself even when loyalty became dangerous. The forged estate transfer shattered Charles because it transformed private trust into public evidence. Yet his final decision gave the scandal its definitive meaning. The monarchy could survive embarrassment, betrayal, and even deception, but only when the crown proved that no relationship, not even the king's marriage, stood above accountability. Thanks for watching. Please don't